There's a moment that arrives quietly, almost like a door closing, when you realize you don't just prefer being alone, you actively dislike being around people. Not specific people, not certain types, but the general experience of human interaction itself. The small talk that goes nowhere, the social rituals that feel like performance, the constant need to manage impressions and read signals and pretend to care about things you don't care about. And while everyone else seems to navigate this naturally, you're exhausted by it, drained by it, increasingly resentful of the expectation that you should enjoy something that feels like work. You've probably felt it, that rising irritation when someone wants your attention, that sense of violation when someone interrupts your solitude, that bone-deep fatigue that comes from spending even brief amounts of time in social situations. And while others call this being antisocial or misanthropic or difficult, you call it something else. Being honest about how people actually make you feel. Which is tired, which is annoyed, which is increasingly convinced that most human interaction is a waste of energy you don't have to spare. People who hate people aren't necessarily cruel, they're not going out of their way to harm anyone or wishing suffering on humanity. They're just deeply allergic to the demands that come with being around other humans, and they've reached a point where they're no longer willing to pretend otherwise. There's a psychology behind this that's more complex than simple introversion, because hating people isn't about needing alone time to recharge. It's about finding human presence itself intrinsically aversive. It's about experiencing other people not as neutral or occasionally pleasant, but as reliably draining, disappointing, or irritating. It's about having tried connection enough times to conclude that the cost consistently outweighs the benefit. Psychologists might call this misanthropy or social aversion, but those terms don't capture the lived experience of it, the way every interaction feels like performing a role you didn't audition for. The way other people's needs feel like demands on your limited resources. The way even well-meaning people seem to require more emotional labor than they're worth. Most people who hate people didn't start out that way. They weren't born with contempt for humanity. They developed it through accumulated disappointment, through pattern recognition that told them people are unreliable, selfish, exhausting, or cruel more often than they're trustworthy, generous, energizing, or kind. Maybe they were betrayed repeatedly. Maybe they were used. Maybe they gave and got nothing back. Maybe they watched people hurt each other for petty reasons and concluded that humans as a species are fundamentally flawed. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe they're just highly sensitive to stimulation and other people represent the loudest, most unpredictable, most demanding form of stimulation that exists, and their nervous system learned early that people equals overwhelm, equals invasion, equals having to be on in a way that depletes them faster than anything else. There's a particular kind of relief that comes with admitting you hate people, because you stop forcing yourself to participate in social rituals that make you miserable. You stop accepting invitations out of obligation. You stop pretending you care about maintaining relationships that feel like maintenance rather than joy. And that honesty, while socially unacceptable, is internally liberating, because you're no longer performing a version of yourself that tolerates what you actually can't stand. And this creates tension because society insists that humans are social creatures, that connection is necessary for well-being, that isolation leads to suffering. But for people who hate people, connection is what leads to suffering. Isolation is relief, and being told they need what makes them miserable feels like being told they're broken for knowing what doesn't work for them. People who hate people often share something in common: high standards combined with consistent disappointment. They see how people could behave, how interactions could go, how relationships could function, and then they watch reality fall short over and over until the gap between expectation and reality becomes unbearable. They're not naive. They're not expecting perfection. They're just tired of the baseline of human behavior being so far below what seems reasonable. And this creates a feedback loop, because the more disappointed they get, the less tolerance they have. The less tolerance they have, the more irritating people seem. The more irritating people seem, the more they withdraw, and the more they withdraw, the fewer positive interactions they have to counterbalance their negative assessment of humanity. There's also something about self-protection, because when you hate people, you're not vulnerable to them. You don't hope for connection, so you can't be disappointed by its absence. You don't expect kindness, so you can't be hurt by cruelty. You don't invest in relationships, so you can't be devastated when they fail. It's armor disguised as misanthropy. It's the decision that being alone and harsh is safer than being open and hurt. And that armor works. It does protect, but it also isolates. It also prevents the possibility of positive experiences with people because you've preemptively decided that all interactions will be negative, that all people will disappoint, that the safest position is complete disengagement. But here's what people don't talk about. Hating people is exhausting in its own way because you still live in a world designed for social interaction. You still have to interface with humans for practical necessities. You still have to navigate a society that rewards social skills and punishes social withdrawal. So you're constantly encountering the thing you hate, constantly having to manage your aversion, constantly being reminded that you're wired differently than what's considered normal or healthy. And that creates a strange duality. You hate people, but you're forced to be around them. You want isolation, but society won't accommodate that desire. You crave a life without human contact, but every system you interact with requires it. Healthcare, employment, housing, basic services. All of it involves people you'd rather not deal with. I remember the first time I admitted to myself that I didn't just prefer being alone, I actively disliked being around people. It felt like confessing something shameful, like admitting a moral failing, because we're taught that loving people is virtuous and hating them is monstrous. But the truth was simpler and less dramatic. I just found most interactions tedious, most people predictable in disappointing ways, most social situations draining. And I was tired of pretending otherwise. Tired of forcing myself to participate in a game I didn't enjoy for rewards I didn't want. If you hate people, you know this moment. That realization that you're not temporarily tired or going through a phase, that this is actually how you feel. That human interaction itself, not just humans, is something you'd rather avoid. And admitting this makes you feel both honest and monstrous because society has very little space for people who genuinely don't like.
The hardest part about hating people is that you can't talk about it honestly. Because when you do, people either try to fix you, telling you to give humanity another chance, suggesting therapy or medication, or that you just haven't met the right people yet, or they distance themselves from you, deciding you're toxic or dangerous or someone to avoid. So you learn to hide it, to say you're introverted when you mean misanthropic, to say you prefer your own company when you mean you can't stand anyone else's, to perform just enough social acceptability that people don't realize how much contempt lies underneath. And that performance is its own exhaustion, that constant need to mask how you actually feel, to pretend you're just shy or selective when really you're repulsed, to act like you might be interested in connection someday when you've already decided you're not. Here's what most people don't understand about those who hate people. It's not always irrational. And it's not always pathological. Sometimes it's the result of paying attention. Sometimes it's pattern recognition working exactly as designed. Sometimes it's the logical conclusion of watching how people actually behave rather than how they claim to behave. Because people lie, people manipulate, people take, people hurt, people disappoint. And if you've experienced enough of that, if you've watched enough hypocrisy and cruelty and selfishness dressed up as virtue, concluding that people in general aren't worth the effort isn't insanity, it's adaptation. And yes, there are exceptions. Yes, there are good people. Yes, not everyone is terrible. But for someone who hates people, those exceptions don't outweigh the rule. The occasional positive interaction doesn't compensate for the consistent negative ones. And the energy required to sort through humans to find the rare good ones feels like more effort than it's worth. Psychologists talk about something called social anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure from social interaction. And people who hate people often have this, but it's not always a disorder. Sometimes it's just how their reward system is calibrated. Where others get dopamine from connection, they get cortisol from obligation. Where others feel energized by interaction, they feel depleted by demand. Where others experience belonging in groups, they experience suffocation in crowds. And when your nervous system is wired this way, when people genuinely don't provide anything positive and consistently provide something negative, hating people isn't dysfunction, it's honesty about your actual experience rather than the experience you're supposed to have. But hating people doesn't mean you want them to suffer. This is important to understand. Misanthropy isn't the same as cruelty. Most people who hate people aren't sadists. They're not seeking to harm, they're seeking to avoid. They don't want people to experience pain, they just don't want to experience people. The hatred is protective and avoidant, not aggressive and destructive. It's the emotional equivalent of an immune system rejecting foreign bodies, not a weapon aimed at targets. And this distinction matters because society often conflates the two, assumes that if you hate people, you must be dangerous, must be a threat, must be someone to watch carefully. But most people who hate people are more likely to hurt themselves through isolation than to hurt others through action. They're turning inward, not outward. They're withdrawing, not attacking. So what makes someone hate people while others love them or at least tolerate them? It's not one thing, it's a combination of temperament, nervous system sensitivity, accumulated experiences, expectation-reality gaps, and learned patterns. Some people are born with nervous systems that find social stimulation overwhelming. Some people develop aversion through repeated negative experiences. Some people have standards that humanity consistently fails to meet. And some people just never developed the reward circuitry that makes connection feel good. And once you're in that place, once people feel more like problems than pleasures, it's hard to shift because every interaction confirms your bias. Every disappointing exchange strengthens your conclusion. Every forced social situation reinforces your desire to be left alone. Here's the shift that's possible, though it's not always necessary. Recognizing that hating people and choosing solitude are different things. One is an emotional stance built on aversion and contempt. The other is a preference built on self-knowledge and peace. You can choose to be alone without hating everyone who isn't you. You can prefer solitude without despising humanity. You can opt out of social interaction without believing that everyone who opts in is worthless or stupid. And that distinction matters because hating people keeps you locked in resentment, keeps you carrying contempt that poisons even your solitude, keeps you defined by what you're against rather than what you're for. But choosing solitude from a place of preference rather than hatred lets you be alone without being bitter, lets you avoid people without despising them, lets you live a life of isolation that feels peaceful rather than hostile. People who hate people aren't all broken, and not all of them need fixing. Some of them have valid reasons based on lived experience. Some of them are protecting themselves in the only way that works. Some of them are just wired differently and living in a world that wasn't designed for their wiring. And yes, some of them would benefit from therapy, from processing trauma, from learning that not all people are like the people who hurt them, but some of them have already done that work and still legitimately prefer minimal human contact because that's what makes them feel best. And both can be true. You can acknowledge that isolation isn't ideal for most humans, while also acknowledging that some humans genuinely thrive in isolation, that some people are happier alone than they'll ever be with others, that for some nervous systems, misanthropy isn't a disorder to cure, but a reality to accommodate. So if you're someone who hates people, you don't necessarily need to change that. You don't necessarily need to force yourself to enjoy what you don't enjoy, to connect with people who drain you, to participate in a social world that makes you miserable. What you might need to examine is whether the hatred itself is serving you, or whether it's just the emotional residue of protecting yourself from harm. Whether you're avoiding people because they genuinely add nothing to your life or because you're afraid of being hurt again. And maybe the answer is both. Maybe people genuinely aren't worth it for you, and you're also carrying old wounds that make them seem worse than they are. But either way, you're allowed to choose isolation. You're allowed to minimize contact. You're allowed to build a life that involves as few people as possible if that's what makes you feel most at peace. You don't owe the world your participation in social rituals. You don't owe humanity your affection or patience or willingness to keep trying. You don't owe anyone an explanation for why you prefer being alone. Hating people might not be pretty and it might not be popular, but if it's honest and if it protects you and if it allows you to build a life that feels bearable, then it's valid, even if it's not ideal. Just make sure it's not the only thing you have. Make sure you're not so consumed by what you hate that you forget what you might love. Make sure your misanthropy leaves room for something other than contempt, even if that something is just peace, just quiet, just the relief of being alone.